in part 2 of our series, Explore God. And if you're here for this series for the first time today, we are joining with churches all around Chicagoland to take part in this initiative where we are asking 7 big questions of life and of faith. And we're exploring those together each week, both here in worship and then also in an education or discussion group format. Last week, we started off with a pretty big question. Does life have a purpose? And the bottom line of last week, where we left it, is that we said life is meaningless without God. But God gives everything meaning. Today, for part 2, we're reflecting on, and maybe question 0, or the very basic, fundamental question of faith itself. Is there a God? The fact that you are here today means that you are at least probably curious, if not convinced, of that question, is there a God? This past week, at our midweek Wednesday night kids and youth program, I was sitting at a table of 7th grade boys. And I thought, this would be a great group to reflect on this question with. And so I posed it to them. What do you all think about this question? Is there a God? And so we talked a little bit. We kind of went back and forth a while. And as I talked with Jack and Brian and Charlie and Riley, they each had some very reflective points. One of them said, I believe in God because of all the good stuff. Another said that I think God is real because the world would be worse off if it wasn't for God. Another of the guys said, well, I think God is real because without God there wouldn't be miracles. And then a poignant one at the end when one of the boys said, sometimes we get what we don't deserve, and that's how I know God is real to me. Like when I haven't studied for a test, but I end up getting a good grade. We've all been there in some way in our life, haven't we, when we've experienced an unexpected blessing. Have you asked this question before? I mean, I know you've asked it probably at some point in your life. What about now, when you ask this question, are you filled with a sense of convicting purpose and belief? Or maybe when you ask this question, do you feel unsure? Unsure of God's presence in the universe, in our world, or in your life? No matter when or if we ask this question, the truth is, even if we're convinced that God doesn't exist, at some point, we all think about this question. It's an impossible question to escape, even if someone isn't a believer, or even if someone isn't necessarily filled with faith themselves. Though what I find is interesting is the number of people who say they don't necessarily believe that God exists, or they don't know with certainty that that is true, but yet maybe they still pray. Someone who in the middle of a particular struggle or difficult circumstance might lift up a prayer to God just on the chance that someone is listening. Maybe you've had your own extended conversation with God, or maybe you've reflected in your own way on a long walk one day through the woods, or on the beach, or maybe on a snowy path. I found a list of questions, actually letters that children had written to God on this same kind of theme. Some very basic questions, thoughts, things that could only come from the mouths and the minds of children. and yet some great wisdom to be found. One child wrote, "Dear God, I read the Bible. What does begat mean? Nobody will tell me. God, I bet it's very hard for you to love everyone in the whole world. There are only 4 people in our family, and I can't even do that. Dear God, are you really invisible, or is that just a trick? Did you really mean do unto others as they do unto you? Because if you did, then I have got to fix my sister. God, maybe Cain wouldn't have killed Abel if they had their own rooms. It sure works out for me and my brother. God, I wish there was no such thing as sin. I wish there was no such thing as war. Can you help? God, it's okay that you made different religions, but don't you get mixed up sometimes? God, how come you did all those miracles in the old days, but don't do any now? We all wonder about God. The problem is, for some of us, when we feel that God doesn't respond to us, that God doesn't write back, that somehow God hasn't revealed to us by putting God's name in the sky or by writing us and leaving us a personal letter, we seem to doubt God's very existence when we don't seem to have a response. Have you been there? Have you yourself felt that way? In the midst of the struggles and trials of life, we can certainly all begin to bargain with God in some way. God, if you'll just prove that you are true to me now, I promise to believe. I promise to follow you for the rest of my life if you'll just give me a sign, just give me a clue. It's kind of like the great philosopher Blaise Pascal, the Pascals Wager, if you've heard of it. He said, in the end, we have a choice. We can wager either belief in God or doubt in God. And his premise was that in the end, if we wager faith, but God doesn't exist, well, what have we lost? But if we wager doubt and come to find that God does exist, well, then we have lost quite a lot. Now, that isn't exactly a perfect defense or explanation of true faith in God, but it does cause us to think and to wonder who might be on the other end of our prayers, to wonder where God is revealed to us. We read in Psalm 19, verse 1, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The sky proclaims God's handiwork." Have you ever been moved when watching the sky fill with light during the perfect sunset? Or maybe awed as you watched water cascade over a waterfall? Or found yourself in a reflective moment as you watched freshly falling snow? That is until you realized you had to go clean it up afterward, shovel the snow. God's handiwork, God's handwriting is all around us. One of the first places that we can discern God's presence in our world is through the creation itself, the beauty that surrounds us, the depth of the world that we have only partially explored. The Apostle Paul picks up on this, as we'll read together in Romans chapter 1, talking about God's creation. In Romans 1:19 and 20, Paul writes this: "This is because what is known about God should be plain to them, because God made it plain to them. Ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, because they are understood through the things God has made, so humans are without excuse." Through creation, the invisible is made visible. The holiness of God is found in the everyday, in what we can sense through the world around us. In fact, there are many scientists, philosophers, and theologians who have reflected on what's known as the finely tuned universe. That things in this world and in the universe as a whole are so finely tuned, there are several factors that make it so that the universe itself exists, that life can be sustained on our planet. There are many factors that go into this, but one in particular is called the density parameter. Now I'm no expert on this, but as I understand it, this has to do with the level of gravity in the universe and also the expansion of energy. So, and meaning, if there was too much gravity, well, then the universe would have collapsed. It wouldn't have been able to expand. And yet, if there wasn't enough gravity, then the stars around us wouldn't have been able to form. We would not have a planet on which to exist. It's the perfect amount of density to provide the world, the sky, and the universe around us. This universe seems to have been finely tuned for our existence. Creation is one place where we can look for signs of God's existence. But so is something else. So is something more intimate to us, something we could call our conscience, our sense of moral order as we distinguish between right and wrong. And so the Apostle Paul, as he was writing Romans, was writing about faith revealed, God's existence revealed, not to Jews, but also to Gentiles. That this was a revelation not specific to any particular people group, but one that was open to all. And Paul reflected particularly on this idea of morality woven into us in the second chapter of Romans. This Romans many consider to be Paul's magnum opus, his greatest letter in all of the Bible. And in the second chapter, both as we read in the first and the second, he's building his argument about God. And so Paul writes in Romans chapter 2, 14 and 15, saying this: Gentiles don't have the law, but when they instinctively do what the law requires, they are a law in themselves. Though they don't have the law, they show the proof of the law written on their hearts, and their consciences affirm it. Their conflicting thoughts will accuse them or even make a defense for them. A conscience is wired within us. As Paul writes, a sense of morality is actually written upon our hearts. And as he argues, it has been placed there for a purpose. The Russian novelist Dostoevsky once wrote that if God doesn't exist, everything is permissible. But that's not how we live. That's not how the world operates. We do have systems of law and of order. Sometimes God's sense of morality is continuing to be revealed to us. And sometimes even the laws that we construct need to be adjusted, need to take account for what God might be doing in this world. So it was during the civil rights movement. Last night, I was reading a speech that Dr. Martin Luther King gave following one of the early civil rights victories. It was December 20th, 1956, and King was addressing approximately 2,500 people at First Baptist Church in Montgomery. This was following a successful end to the Montgomery bus boycott that had been going on for over a year at that point to protest the segregated city buses in the city of Montgomery. In what was a victory for this movement, King cautioned that this victory wasn't to go to the heads of those who were leading this movement, but it was to be taken with humility, knowing that there is a deeper moral order at work. I was struck by something that King said that appears in several of his other speeches and letters. He spoke this to the crowd. He said, "But amid all of this, we have kept going with the faith that as we struggle, God struggles with us. And that the arc of the moral universe, although long, is bending toward justice. We have lived under the agony and darkness of Good Friday with the conviction that one day the heightening glow of Easter would emerge on the horizon. We have seen truth crucified and goodness buried, but we have kept going with the conviction that truth crushed to earth will rise again." The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. There is something within each of us, within the very fabric of creation. There is a sense of morality, a sense of order that we continue to get greater clarity on as we live and move and have our being in this world. Through creation and conscience, we see evidence of God's existence. According to the Pew Research Center, 80% of people say that they believe in God. And of those 80%, 50% believe in the God revealed through the Bible. The majority of people seem to believe that there is a power at work in this world. Some define this power, this God, through a particular biblical lens, and others not. What about you? Do you fall in the 50%, the 80%, or maybe the 20%? Where does this question come to you today? Where does it intersect with your life? But I think, particularly for a follower of Jesus, maybe the more important question is, does your life reflect a belief in God? Is your faith something that's simply lip service, or is your life, how you spend your time, how you interact with others, is that reflective of a belief in God? That, my friends, I think is the true and significant question of those who would claim to have a belief in the God of the universe, the God of the Bible. I think there is one thing that all of us have in common. Believers, non-believers, it's this: that in the end, we all live by faith. We all live by faith. It's true. I mean, you've probably spoken with someone who says, well, I only put my trust in things that can be proven by science, things that are rational, things that can be investigated. And I understand that, and I appreciate that, and I affirm that. But all of us go to bed at night in our homes with faith that our heating will remain on. We don't wake up in the middle of the night, at least most of us probably don't, and go investigate the piping and go down deep into the depths of our basement and make sure that everything is flowing as it should be. We just don't do that. But we do wake up in the morning and we have breakfast. We have faith that the food on our table has been prepared properly. We don't go to the manufacturer of the cereal. We don't track down where the produce may have originated and make sure that it was prepared properly. We don't do that. We have faith in that. When we're driving to work or taking public transportation, we don't always go out and inspect our car and make sure everything looks good. At every stoplight, we don't get out and make sure the person in front of us is going to stop. We don't inspect the train tracks to make sure that everything is as it should be. We have faith in these things. We live by faith. What would it look like in our church and in our community if we didn't just live by the faith that there is a God, but we lived with the sense of truth that there is a God who cares for each one of us and has a plan for our lives? Imagine the impact that would have. That in itself could change the world. Imagine how it would impact our workplaces. When we were not just operating for a bottom line, but we were operating from a sense of a greater faith-oriented perspective. Imagine how that would impact our schools, our teachers, our young people, and our administrators if they felt that there was someone greater caring for them. Imagine how it would impact our families, our neighborhoods. Not that there is a God, but that there's a God who cares for us and who has plans for us that are greater than we could ever come up with on our own. If you're looking for signs of God's presence and existence, you might see them in the beauty of creation. You might sense them in your own moral compass within. And you might experience signs of God's presence in ways that you never experienced. But in the end, if we look closely enough, we will find evidence of God's existence. Amen.